Chapter 18. Mary Brings Evil Tidings. Mary Vance, whom Mrs. Elliott had sent up to the manse on an errand, came tripping down Rainbow Valley on her way to Ingleside, where she was to spend the afternoon with Nan and Di as a Saturday treat. Nan and Di had been picking spruce gum with Faith and Una in the manse woods, and the four of them were now sitting on a fallen pine by the brook, all, it must be admitted, chewing rather vigorously. The Ingleside twins were not allowed to chew spruce gum anywhere but in the seclusion of Rainbow Valley, but Faith and Una were unrestricted by such rules of etiquette and cheerfully chewed it everywhere, at home and abroad, to the very proper horror of the Glen. Faith had been chewing it in church one day, but Jerry had realized the enormity of that and had given her such an older brotherly scolding that she never did it again. "I was so hungry I just felt as if I had to chew something," she protested. "You know well enough what breakfast was like, Jerry Meredith. I couldn't eat scorched porridge, and my stomach just felt so queer and empty. The gum helped a lot, and I didn't chew very hard. I didn't make any noise, and I never cracked the gum once." "You mustn't chew gum in church anyhow," insisted Jerry. "Don't let me catch you at it again." "You chewed yourself in prayer meeting last week," cried Faith. "That's different," said Jerry loftily. "Prayer meeting isn't on Sunday. Besides, I sat away at the back in a dark seat and nobody saw me. You were sitting right up front where everyone saw you. And I took the gum out of my mouth for the last hymn and stuck it on the back of the pew in front of me. Then I came away and forgot it. I went back to get it next morning, but it was gone. I suppose Rod Warren swiped it. And it was a dandy chew." Mary Vance walked down the valley with her head held high. She had on a new blue velvet cap with a scarlet rosette in it, a coat of navy blue cloth, and a little squirrel fur muff. She was very conscious of her new clothes and very well pleased with herself. Her hair was elaborately crimped, her face was quite plump, her cheeks rosy, her white eyes shining. She did not look much like the forlorn and ragged waif the Merediths have found in the old Taylor barn. Una tried not to feel envious. Here was Mary with a new velvet cap, but she and Faith had to wear their shabby old gray tams again this winter. Nobody ever thought of getting them new ones, and they were afraid to ask their father for them for fear he might be short of money, and then he would feel badly. Mary had told them once that ministers were always short of money and found it awful hard to make ends meet. Since then, Faith and Una would have gone in rags rather than ask their father for anything if they could help it. They did not worry a great deal over their shabbiness, but it was rather trying to see Mary Vance coming out in such style and putting on such airs about it, too. The new squirrel muff was really the last straw. Neither Faith nor Una had ever had a muff, counting themselves lucky if they could compass mittens without holes in them. Aunt Martha could not see to darn holes, and though Una tried to, she made sad cobbling. Somehow they could not make their greeting of Mary very cordial. But Mary did not mind or notice that. She was not overly sensitive. She vaulted lightly to a seat on the pine tree and laid the offending muff on a bough. Una saw that it was lined with shirred red satin and had red tassels. She looked down at her own rather purpled, chapped little hands and wondered if she would ever be able to put them into a muff like that. "Give us a chew," said Mary companionably. Nan, Di, and Faith all produced an amber-hued knot or two from their pockets and passed them to Mary. Una sat very still. She had 4 lovely big knots in the pocket of her tight, threadbare little jacket, but she wasn't going to give one of them to Mary Vance. Not one. Let Mary pick her own gum. People with squirrel muffs needn't expect to get everything in the world. "Great day, isn't it?" said Mary, swinging her legs, the better, perhaps, to display new boots with very smart cloth tops. Una tucked her feet under her. There was a hole in the toe of one of her boots and both laces were much knotted. But they were the best she had. Oh, this Mary Vance! Why hadn't they left her in the old barn? Una never felt badly because the Ingleside twins were better dressed than she and Faith were. They wore their pretty clothes with careless grace and never seemed to think about them at all. Somehow they did not make other people feel shabby. But when Mary Vance was dressed up, she seemed fairly to exude clothes, to walk in an atmosphere of clothes, to make everybody else feel and think clothes. Una, as she sat there in the honey-tinted sunshine of the gracious December afternoon, was acutely and miserably conscious of everything she had on. The faded tam, which was yet her best, the skimpy jacket she had worn for 3 winters, the holes in her skirt and her boots, the shivering insufficiency of her poor little undergarments. Of course, Mary was going out for a visit and she was not. But even if she had been, she had nothing better to put on, and in this lay the sting. "Say, this is great gum. Listen to me cracking it. There ain't any gum spruces down at Four Winds," said Mary. "Sometimes I just hanker after a chew. Mrs. Elliott won't let me chew gum if she sees me. She says it ain't ladylike. This lady business puzzles me. I can't get on to all its kinks. Say, Una, what's the matter with you? Cat got your tongue?" "No," said Una, who could not drag her fascinated eyes from that squirrel muff. Mary leaned past her, picked it up, and thrust it into Una's hands. "Stick your paws in that for a while," she ordered. "They look sort of pinched. Ain't that a dandy muff? Mrs. Elliott give it to me last week for a birthday present. I'm to get the collar at Christmas. I heard her telling Mr. Elliott that." "Mrs. Elliott is very good to you," said Faith. "And I'm good to her, too," retorted Mary. "I work like a nigger to make it easy for her and have everything just as she likes it. We was made for each other. 'Tisn't everyone could get along with her as well as I do. She's pisen neat, but so am I, and so we agree fine." "I told you she would never whip you." "So you did. She's never tried to lay a finger on me, and I ain't never told a lie to her. Not one, true's you live. She combs me down with her tongue sometimes, though, but that just slips off me like water off a duck's back. Say, Una, why didn't you hang on to the muff?" Una had put it back on the bough. "My hands aren't cold, thank you," she said stiffly. "Well, if you're satisfied, I am. Say, old Kitty Alec has come back to church as meek as Moses, and nobody knows why. But everybody is saying it was Faith brought Norman Douglas out. His housekeeper says you went there and gave him an awful tongue lashing. Did you?" "I went and asked him to come to church," said Faith uncomfortably. "Fancy your spunk," said Mary admiringly. "I wouldn't have dared to do that, and I'm not so slow. Mrs. Wilson says the two of you jawed something scandalous, but you come off best, and then he just turned round and liked to eat you up. Say, is your father going to preach here tomorrow?" "No, he's going to exchange with Mr. Perry from Charlottetown. Father went to town this morning and Mr. Perry's coming out tonight." "I thought there was something in the wind, though old Martha wouldn't give me any satisfaction. But I felt sure she wouldn't have been killing that rooster for nothing." "What rooster? What do you mean?" cried Faith, turning pale. "I don't know what rooster. I didn't see it. When she took the butter Mrs. Elliott sent up, she said she'd been out to the barn killing a rooster for dinner tomorrow." Faith sprang down from the pine. "It's Adam. We have no other rooster. She's killed Adam." "Now, don't fly off the handle. Martha said the butcher at the Glen had no meat this week, and she had to have something, and the hens were all laying and too poor." "If she's killed Adam—" Faith began to run up the hill. Mary shrugged her shoulders. "She'll go crazy now. She was so fond of that Adam. He ought to have been in the pot long ago. He'll be as tough as sole leather. But I wouldn't like to be in Martha's shoes. Faith's just white with rage. Una, you'd better go after her and try to pacify her." Mary had gone a few steps with the Blythe girls when Una suddenly turned and ran after her. "Here's some gum for you, Mary," she said, with a little repentant catch in her voice, thrusting all her 4 knots into Mary's hands. "And I'm glad you have such a pretty muff." "Why, thanks," said Mary, rather taken by surprise. To the Blythe girls, after Una had gone, she said, "Ain't she a queer little mite? But I've always said she had a good heart." Chapter 19. Poor Adam. When Una got home, Faith was lying face downwards on her bed, utterly refusing to be comforted. Aunt Martha had killed Adam. He was reposing on a platter in the pantry that very minute, trussed and dressed, encircled by his liver and heart and gizzard. Aunt Martha heeded Faith's passion of grief and anger not a whit. "We had to have something for the strange minister's dinner," she said. "You're too big a girl to make such a fuss over an old rooster. You knew he'd have to be killed sometime." "I'll tell father when he comes home what you've done," sobbed Faith. "Don't you go bothering your poor father. He has troubles enough, and I'm housekeeper here." "Adam was mine. Mrs. Johnson gave him to me. You had no business to touch him," stormed Faith. "Don't you get sassy now. The rooster's killed and there's an end of it. I ain't going to set no strange minister down to a dinner of cold boiled mutton. I was brought up to know better than that, if I have come down in the world." Faith would not go down to supper that night, and she would not go to church the next morning. But at dinner time she went to the table, her eyes swollen with crying, her face sullen. The Reverend James Perry was a sleek, rubicund man, with a bristling white moustache, bushy white eyebrows, and a shining bald head. He was certainly not handsome, and he was a very tiresome, pompous sort of person. But if he had looked like the Archangel Michael and talked with the tongues of men and angels, Faith would still have utterly detested him. He carved Adam up dexterously, showing off his plump white hands and very handsome diamond ring. Also, he made jovial remarks all through the performance. Jerry and Carl giggled, and even Una smiled wanly because she thought politeness demanded it. But Faith only scowled darkly. The Reverend James thought her manners shockingly bad. Once, when he was delivering himself of an unctuous remark to Jerry, Faith broke in rudely with a flat contradiction. The Reverend James drew his bushy eyebrows together at her. "Little girls should not interrupt," he said, "and they should not contradict people who know far more than they do." This put Faith in a worse temper than ever. To be called little girl, as if she were no bigger than chubby Rilla Blythe over at Ingleside. It was insufferable. And how that abominable Mr. Perry did eat. He even picked poor Adam's bones. Neither Faith nor Una would touch a mouthful and looked upon the boys as little better than cannibals. Faith felt that if that awful repast did not soon come to an end, she would wind it up by throwing something at Mr. Perry's gleaming head. Fortunately, Mr. Perry found Aunt Martha's leathery apple pie too much even for his powers of mastication, and the meal came to an end after a long grace in which Mr. Perry offered up devout thanks for the food which a kind and beneficent Providence had provided for sustenance and temperate pleasure. "God hadn't a single thing to do with providing Adam for you," muttered Faith rebelliously under her breath. The boys gladly made their escape to outdoors. Una went to help Aunt Martha with the dishes, though that rather grumpy old dame never welcomed her timid assistance, and Faith betook herself to the study, where a cheerful wood fire was burning in the grate. She thought she would thereby escape from the hated Mr. Perry, who had announced his intention of taking a nap in his room during the afternoon. But scarcely had Faith settled herself in a corner with a book when he walked in and, standing before the fire, proceeded to survey the disorderly study with an air of disapproval. "Your father's books seem to be in somewhat deplorable confusion, my little girl," he said severely. Faith darkled in her corner and said not a word. She would not talk to this creature. "You should try to put them in order," Mr. Perry went on, playing with his handsome watch chain and smiling patronizingly on Faith. "You are quite old enough to attend to such duties. My little daughter at home is only 10, and she is already an excellent little housekeeper and the greatest help and comfort to her mother. She is a very sweet child. I wish you had the privilege of her acquaintance. She could help you in many ways. Of course, you have not had the inestimable privilege of a good mother's care and training. A sad lack, a very sad lack. I have spoken more than once to your father in this connection and pointed out his duty to him faithfully, but so far with no effect. I trust he may awaken to a realization of his responsibility before it is too late. In the meantime, it is your duty and privilege to endeavour to take your sainted mother's place. You might exercise a great influence over your brothers and your little sister. You might be a true mother to them. I fear that you do not think of these things as you should. My dear child, allow me to open your eyes in regard to them." Mr. Perry's oily, complacent voice trickled on. He was in his element. Nothing suited him better than to lay down the law, patronize and exhort. He had no idea of stopping, and he did not stop. He stood before the fire, his feet planted firmly on the rug, and poured out a flood of pompous platitudes. Faith heard not a word. She was really not listening to him at all, but she was watching his long black coat-tails with impish delight growing in her brown eyes. Mr. Perry was standing very near the fire. His coat-tails began to scorch. His coat-tails began to smoke. He still prosed on, wrapped up in his own eloquence. The coat-tails smoked worse. A tiny spark flew up from the burning wood and alighted in the middle of one. It clung and caught and spread into a smouldering flame. Faith could restrain herself no longer and broke into a stifled giggle. Mr. Perry stopped short, angered over this impertinence. Suddenly he became conscious that a reek of burning cloth filled the room. He whirled round and saw nothing. Then he clapped his hands to his coat-tails and brought them around in front of him. There was already quite a hole in one of them, and this was his new suit. Faith shook with helpless laughter over his pose and expression. "Did you see my coat-tails burning?" he demanded angrily. "Yes, sir," said Faith demurely. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, glaring at her. "You said it wasn't good manners to interrupt, sir," said Faith, more demurely still. If I was your father, I would give you a spanking that you would remember all your life, miss," said a very angry reverend gentleman as he stalked out of the study. The coat of Mr. Meredith's second-best suit would not fit Mr. Perry, so he had to go to the evening service with his singed coat-tail. But he did not walk up the aisle with his usual consciousness of the honour he was conferring on the building. He never would agree to an exchange of pulpits with Mr. Meredith again, and he was barely civil to the latter when they met for a few minutes at the station the next morning. But Faith felt a certain gloomy satisfaction. Adam was partially avenged. Chapter 20. Faith Makes a Friend. Next day in school was a hard one for Faith. Mary Vance had told the tale of Adam, and all the scholars, except the Blythes, thought it quite a joke. The girls told Faith, between giggles, that it was too bad, and the boys wrote sardonic notes of condolence to her. Poor Faith went home from school feeling her very soul raw and smarting within her. "I'm going over to Ingleside to have a talk with Mrs. Blythe," she sobbed. "She won't laugh at me, as everybody else does. I've just got to talk to somebody who understands how bad I feel." She ran down through Rainbow Valley. Enchantment had been at work the night before. A light snow had fallen, and the powdered firs were dreaming of a spring to come and a joy to be. The long hill beyond was richly purple with leafless beeches. The rosy light of sunset lay over the world like a pink kiss. Of all the airy, fairy places, full of weird, elfin grace, Rainbow Valley that winter evening was the most beautiful. But all its dreamlike loveliness was lost on poor, sore-hearted little Faith. By the brook she came suddenly upon Rosemary West, who was sitting on the old pine tree. She was on her way home from Ingleside, where she had been giving the girls their music lesson. She had been lingering in Rainbow Valley quite a little time, looking across its white beauty and roaming some byways of dream. Judging from the expression of her face, her thoughts were pleasant ones. Perhaps the faint, occasional tinkle from the bells on the Tree Lovers brought the little lurking smile to her lips. Or perhaps it was occasioned by the consciousness that John Meredith seldom failed to spend Monday evening in the grey house on the white, wind-swept hill. Into Rosemary's dreams burst Faith Meredith, full of rebellious bitterness. Faith stopped abruptly when she saw Miss West. She did not know her very well, just well enough to speak to when they met, and she did not want to see anyone just then except Mrs. Blythe. She knew her eyes and nose were red and swollen, and she hated to have a stranger know she had been crying. "Good evening, Miss West," she said uncomfortably. "What is the matter, Faith?" asked Rosemary gently. "Nothing," said Faith rather shortly. "Oh," Rosemary smiled. "You mean nothing you can tell to outsiders, don't you?" Faith looked at Miss West with sudden interest. Here was a person who understood things. And how pretty she was! How golden her hair was under her plumy hat! How pink her cheeks were over her velvet coat! How blue and companionable her eyes were! Faith felt that Miss West could be a lovely friend. If only she were a friend instead of a stranger. I'm going up to tell Mrs. Blythe," said Faith. "She always understands. She never laughs at us. I always talk things over with her. It helps." "Dear girlie, I'm sorry to have to tell you that Mrs. Blythe isn't home," said Miss West sympathetically. "She went to Avonlea today and isn't coming back till the last of the week." Faith's lip quivered. "Then I might as well go home again," she said miserably. "I suppose so. Unless you think you could bring yourself to talk it over with me instead," said Miss Rosemary gently. "It is such a help to talk things over. I know. I don't suppose I can be as good at understanding it, Mrs. Blythe, but I promise you that I won't laugh." "You wouldn't laugh outside," hesitated Faith, "but you might inside." "No, I wouldn't laugh inside either. Why should I? Something has hurt you. It never amuses me to see anybody hurt, no matter what hurts them. If you feel that you'd like to tell me what has hurt you, I'll be glad to listen. But if you think you'd rather not, that's all right too, dear." Faith took another long, earnest look into Miss West's eyes. They were very serious. There was no laughter in them, not even far, far back. With a little sigh, she sat down on the old pine beside her new friend and told her all about Adam and his cruel fate. Rosemary did not laugh or feel like laughing. She understood and sympathized. Really, she was almost as good as Mrs. Blythe. Yes, quite as good. "Mr. Perry is a minister, but he should have been a butcher," said Faith bitterly. "He is so fond of carving things up. He enjoyed cutting poor Adam to pieces. He just sliced into him as if he were any common rooster." "Between you and me, Faith, I don't like Mr. Perry very well myself," said Rosemary, laughing a little, but at Mr. Perry, not at Adam, as Faith clearly understood. "I never did like him. I went to school with him. He was a Glen boy, you know, and he was a most detestable little prig even then. Oh, how we girls used to hate holding his fat, clammy hands in the ring-around games. But we must remember, dear, that he didn't know that Adam had been a pet of yours. He thought he was just a common rooster. We must be just, even when we are terribly hurt." "I suppose so," admitted Faith. "But why does everybody seem to think it funny that I should have loved Adam so much, Miss West? If it had been a horrid old cat, nobody would have thought it queer. When Lottie Warren's kitten had its legs cut off by the binder, everybody was sorry for her. She cried 2 days in school and nobody laughed at her, not even Dan Reese. And all her chums went to the kitten's funeral and helped her bury it, only they couldn't bury its poor little paws with it because they couldn't find them. It was a horrid thing to have happen, of course, but I don't think it was as dreadful as seeing your pet eaten up. Yet everybody laughs at me." "I think it is because the name Rooster seems rather a funny one," said Rosemary gravely. "There is something in it that is comical. Now, chicken is different. It doesn't sound so funny to talk of loving a chicken." "Adam was the dearest little chicken, Miss West. He was just a little golden ball. He would run up to me and peck out of my hand. And he was handsome when he grew up, too, white as snow, with such a beautiful curving white tail, though Mary Vance said it was too short. He knew his name and always came when I called him. He was a very intelligent rooster, and Aunt Martha had no right to kill him. He was mine. It wasn't fair, was it, Miss West?" "No, it wasn't," said Rosemary decidedly. "Not a bit fair. I remember I had a pet hen when I was a little girl. She was such a pretty little thing, all golden brown and speckly. I loved her as much as I ever loved any pet. She was never killed. She died of old age. Mother wouldn't have killed her because she was my pet." "If my mother had been living, she wouldn't have let Adam be killed," said Faith. "For that matter, Father wouldn't have either, if he'd been home and known of it. I'm sure he wouldn't, Miss West." "I'm sure too," said Rosemary. There was a little added flush on her face. She looked rather conscious, but Faith noticed nothing. "Was it very wicked of me not to tell Mr. Perry his coat-tails were scorching?" she asked anxiously. "Oh, terribly wicked," answered Rosemary with dancing eyes. "But I would have been just as naughty, Faith. I wouldn't have told him they were scorching, and I don't believe I would ever have been a bit sorry for my wickedness either." "Una thought I should have told him because he was a minister." "Dearest, if a minister doesn't behave as a gentleman, we are not bound to respect his coat-tails. I know I would have just loved to see Jimmy Perry's coat-tails burning up. It must have been fun." Both laughed, but Faith ended with a bitter little sigh. "Well, anyway, Adam is dead and I am never going to love anything again." "Don't say that, dear. We miss so much out of life if we don't love. The more we love, the richer life is, even if it is only some little furry or feathery pet. Would you like a canary, Faith? A little golden bit of a canary? If you would, I'll give you one. We have 2 up home." "Oh, I would like that," cried Faith. "I love birds. Only, would Aunt Martha's cat eat it? It's so tragic to have your pets eaten. I don't think I could endure it a second time." "If you hang the cage far enough from the wall, I don't think the cat could harm it. I'll tell you just how to take care of it, and I'll bring it to Ingleside for you next time I come down." To herself, Rosemary was thinking, "It will give every gossip in the Glen something to think of, but I will not care. I want to comfort this poor little heart." Faith was comforted. Sympathy and understanding were very sweet. She and Miss Rosemary sat on the old pine until the twilight crept softly down over the White Valley and the evening star shone over the gray maple grove. Faith told Rosemary all her small history and hopes, her likes and dislikes, the ins and outs of life at the manse, the ups and downs of school society. Finally they parted, firm friends. Mr. Meredith was, as usual, lost in dreams when supper began that evening, but presently a name pierced his abstraction and brought him back to reality. Faith was telling Una of her meeting with Rosemary. "She is just lovely, I think," said Faith. "Just as nice as Mrs. Blythe, but different. I felt as if I wanted to hug her. She did hug me. Such a nice velvety hug. And she called me dearest. It thrilled me. I could tell her anything." "So you liked Miss West, Faith?" Mr. Meredith asked with a rather odd intonation. "I love her," cried Faith. "Ah," said Mr. Meredith. "Ah." Chapter 21. The Impossible Word. John Meredith walked meditatively through the clear crispness of a winter night in Rainbow Valley. The hills beyond glistened with the chill, splendid luster of moonlight on snow. Every little fir tree in the long valley sang its own wild song to the harp of wind and frost. His children and the Blythe lads and lasses were coasting down the eastern slope and whizzing over the glassy pond. They were having a glorious time, and their gay voices and gayer laughter echoed up and down the valley, dying away in elfin cadences among the trees. On the right, the lights of Ingleside gleamed through the maple grove with the genial lure and invitation which seems always to glow in the beacons of a home where we know there is love and good cheer and a welcome for all kin, whether of flesh or spirit. Mr. Meredith liked very well on occasion to spend an evening arguing with the doctor by the driftwood fire, where the famous china dogs of Ingleside kept ceaseless watch and ward, as became deities of the hearth. But tonight he did not look that way. Far on the western hill gleamed a paler but more alluring star. Mr. Meredith was on his way to see Rosemary West, and he meant to tell her something which had been slowly blossoming in his heart since their first meeting, and had sprung into full flower on the evening when Faith had so warmly voiced her admiration for Rosemary. He had come to realize that he had learned to care for Rosemary. Not as he had cared for Cecilia, of course. That was entirely different. That love of romance and dream and glamour could never, he thought, return. But Rosemary was beautiful and sweet and dear, very dear. She was the best of companions. He was happier in her company than he had ever expected to be again. She would be an ideal mistress for his home, a good mother to his children. During the years of his widowhood, Mr. Meredith had received innumerable hints from brother members of Presbytery and from many parishioners who could not be suspected of any ulterior motive, as well as from some who could, that he ought to marry again. But these hints never made any impression on him. It was commonly thought he was never aware of them, but he was quite acutely aware of them. And in his own occasional visitations of common sense he knew that the common sensible thing for him to do was to marry. But common sense was not the strong point of John Meredith, and to choose out deliberately and cold-bloodedly some suitable woman, as one might choose a housekeeper or a business partner, was something he was quite incapable of doing. How he hated that word, suitable. It reminded him so strongly of James Perry. "A suitable woman of suitable age," that unctuous brother of the cloth had said in his far from subtle hint. For the moment John Meredith had had a perfectly unbelievable desire to rush madly away and propose marriage to the youngest, most unsuitable woman it was possible to discover. Mrs. Marshall Elliott was his good friend and he liked her. But when she had bluntly told him he should marry again, he felt as if she had torn away the veil that hung before some sacred shrine of his innermost life, and he had been more or less afraid of her ever since. He knew there were women in his congregation of suitable age who would marry him quite readily. That fact had seeped through all his abstraction very early in his ministry in Glen St. Mary. They were good, substantial, uninteresting women. One or two fairly comely, the others not exactly so, and John Meredith would as soon have thought of marrying any one of them as of hanging himself. He had some ideals to which no seeming necessity could make him false. He could ask no woman to fill Cecilia's place in his home unless he could offer her at least some of the affection and homage he had given to his girlish bride. And where, in his limited feminine acquaintance, was such a woman to be found? Rosemary West had come into his life on that autumn evening, bringing with her an atmosphere in which his spirit recognized native air. Across the gulf of strangerhood they clasped hands of friendship. He knew her better in that 10 minutes by the hidden spring than he knew Emmeline Drew or Elizabeth Kirk or Amy Annetta Douglas in a year, or could know them in a century. He had fled to her for comfort when Mrs. Alec Davis had outraged his mind and soul, and had found it. Since then he had gone often to the house on the hill, slipping through the shadowy paths of night in Rainbow Valley so astutely that Glen gossip could never be absolutely certain that he did go to see Rosemary West. Once or twice he had been caught in the West living room by other visitors. That was all the Ladies' Aid had to go by. But when Elizabeth Kirk heard it, she put away a secret hope she had allowed herself to cherish without a change of expression on her kind, plain face. And Emmeline Drew resolved that the next time she saw a certain old bachelor of Lowbridge she would not snub him as she had done at a previous meeting. Of course, if Rosemary West was out to catch the minister, she would catch him. She looked younger than she was, and men thought her pretty. Besides, the West girls had money. "It is to be hoped that he won't be so absent-minded as to propose to Ellen by mistake," was the only malicious thing she allowed herself to say to a sympathetic sister Drew. Emmeline bore no further grudge towards Rosemary. When all was said and done, an unencumbered bachelor was far better than a widower with 4 children. It had been only the glamour of the manse that had temporarily blinded Emmeline's eyes to the better part. A sled with 3 shrieking occupants sped past Mr. Meredith to the pond. Faith's long curls streamed in the wind, and her laughter rang above that of the others. John Meredith looked after them kindly and longingly. He was glad that his children had such chums as the Blythes, glad that they had so wise and gay and tender a friend as Mrs. Blythe. But they needed something more, and that something would be supplied when he brought Rosemary West as a bride to the old manse. There was in her a quality essentially maternal. It was Saturday night, and he did not often go calling on Saturday night, which was supposed to be dedicated to a thoughtful revision of Sunday's sermon. But he had chosen this night because he had learned that Ellen West was going to be away and Rosemary would be alone. Often as he had spent pleasant evenings in the house on the hill, he had never, since that first meeting at the spring, seen Rosemary alone. Ellen had always been there. He did not precisely object to Ellen being there. He liked Ellen West very much, and they were the best of friends. Ellen had an almost masculine understanding and a sense of humour which his own shy, hidden appreciation of fun found very agreeable. He liked her interest in politics and world events. There was no man in the Glen, not even excepting Dr. Blythe, who had a better grasp of such things. "I think it is just as well to be interested in things as long as you live," she had said. "If you're not, it doesn't seem to me that there's much difference between the quick and the dead." He liked her pleasant, deep, rumbly voice. He liked the hearty laugh with which she always ended up some jolly and well-told story. She never gave him digs about his children as other Glen women did. She never bored him with local gossip. She had no malice and no pettiness. She was always splendidly sincere. Mr. Meredith, who had picked up Miss Cornelia's way of classifying people, considered that Ellen belonged to the race of Joseph. Altogether an admirable woman for a sister-in-law. Nevertheless, a man did not want even the most admirable of women around when he was proposing to another woman. And Ellen was always around. She did not insist on talking to Mr. Meredith herself all the time. She let Rosemary have a fair share of him. Many evenings, indeed, Ellen effaced herself almost totally, sitting back in the corner with St. George in her lap and letting Mr. Meredith and Rosemary talk and sing and read books together. Sometimes they quite forgot her presence. But if their conversation or choice of duets ever betrayed the least tendency to what Ellen considered philandering, Ellen promptly nipped that tendency in the bud and blotted Rosemary out for the rest of the evening. But not even the grimmest of amiable dragons can altogether prevent a certain subtle language of eye and smile and eloquent silence. And so the minister's courtship progressed after a fashion. But if it was ever to reach a climax, that climax must come when Ellen was away. And Ellen was so seldom away, especially in winter. She found her own fireside the pleasantest place in the world, she vowed. Gadding had no attraction for her. She was fond of company, but she wanted it at home. Mr. Meredith had almost been driven to the conclusion that he must write to Rosemary what he wanted to say, when Ellen casually announced one evening that she was going to a silver wedding next Saturday night. She had been bridesmaid when the principals were married. Only old guests were invited, so Rosemary was not included. Mr. Meredith pricked up his ears a trifle, and a gleam flashed into his dreamy dark eyes. Both Ellen and Rosemary saw it, and both Ellen and Rosemary felt, with a tingling shock, that Mr. Meredith would certainly come up the hill next Saturday night. "Might as well have it over with, St. George," Ellen sternly told the black cat after Mr. Meredith had gone home and Rosemary had silently gone upstairs. "He means to ask her, St. George. I'm perfectly sure of that. So he might as well have his chance to do it and find out he can't get her, George. She'd rather like to take him, Saint, I know that, but she promised and she's got to keep her promise. I'm rather sorry in some ways, St. George. I don't know of a man I'd sooner have for a brother-in-law, if a brother-in-law was convenient. I haven't a thing against him, Saint, not a thing, except that he won't see and can't be made to see that the Kaiser is a menace to the peace of Europe. That's his blind spot. But he's good company and I like him. A woman can say anything she likes to a man with a mouth like John Meredith's and be sure of not being misunderstood. Such a man is more precious than rubies, Saint, and much rarer, George. But he can't have Rosemary, and I suppose when he finds out he can't have her, he'll drop us both. And we'll miss him, Saint. We'll miss him something scandalous, George. But she promised, and I'll see that she keeps her promise." Ellen's face looked almost ugly in its lowering resolution. Upstairs, Rosemary was crying into her pillow. So Mr. Meredith found his lady alone and looking very beautiful. Rosemary had not made any special toilet for the occasion. She wanted to, but she thought it would be absurd to dress up for a man you meant to refuse. So she wore her plain, dark afternoon dress and looked like a queen in it. Her suppressed excitement coloured her face to brilliancy. Her great blue eyes were pools of light less placid than usual. She wished the interview were over. She had looked forward to it all day with dread. She felt quite sure that John Meredith cared a great deal for her, after a fashion, and she felt just as sure that he did not care for her as he had cared for his first love. She felt that her refusal would disappoint him considerably, but she did not think it would altogether overwhelm him. Yet she hated to make it, hated for his sake, and Rosemary was quite honest with herself, for her own. She knew she could have loved John Meredith if it had been permissible. She knew that life would be a blank thing if, rejected as lover, he refused longer to be a friend. She knew that she could be very happy with him and that she could make him happy, but between her and happiness stood the prison gate of the promise she had made to Ellen years ago. Rosemary could not remember her father. He had died when she was only 3 years old. Ellen, who had been 13, remembered him, but with no special tenderness. He had been a stern, reserved man many years older than his fair, pretty wife. 5 years later, their brother of 12 died also. Since his death, the 2 girls had always lived alone with their mother. They had never mingled very freely in the social life of the Glen or Lowbridge, though where they went the wit and spirit of Ellen and the sweetness and beauty of Rosemary made them welcome guests. Both had what was called a disappointment in their girlhood. The sea had not given up Rosemary's lover, and Norman Douglas, then a handsome, red-haired young giant, noted for wild driving and noisy though harmless escapades, had quarrelled with Ellen and left her in a fit of pique. There were not lacking candidates for both Martin's and Norman's places, but none seemed to find favour in the eyes of the West girls, who drifted slowly out of youth and bellhood without any seeming regret. They were devoted to their mother, who was a chronic invalid. The 3 had a little circle of home interests, books, pets, and flowers, which made them happy and contented. Mrs. West's death, which occurred on Rosemary's 25th birthday, was a bitter grief to them. At first they were intolerably lonely. Ellen especially continued to grieve and brood, her long, moody musings broken only by fits of stormy, passionate weeping. The old Lowbridge doctor told Rosemary that he feared permanent melancholy, or worse. Once, when Ellen had sat all day, refusing either to speak or eat, Rosemary had flung herself on her knees by her sister's side. "Oh, Ellen, you have me yet," she said imploringly. "Am I nothing to you? We have always loved each other so." "I won't have you always," Ellen had said, breaking her silence with harsh intensity. "You will marry and leave me. I shall be left all alone. I cannot bear the thought. I cannot. I would rather die." "I will never marry," said Rosemary. "Never, Ellen." Ellen bent forward and looked searchingly into Rosemary's eyes. "Will you promise me that solemnly?" she said. "Promise it on Mother's Bible." Rosemary assented at once, quite willing to humour Ellen. What did it matter? She knew quite well she would never want to marry anyone. Her love had gone down with Martin Crawford to the deeps of the sea, and without love she could not marry anyone. So she promised readily, though Ellen made rather a fearsome rite of it. They clasped hands over the Bible in their mother's vacant room and both vowed to each other that they would never marry and would always live together. Ellen's condition improved from that hour. She soon regained her normal cheery poise. For 10 years she and Rosemary lived in the old house happily, undisturbed by any thoughts of marrying or giving in marriage. Their promise sat very lightly on them. Ellen never failed to remind her sister of it whenever any eligible male creature crossed their paths, but she had never been really alarmed until John Meredith came home that night with Rosemary. As for Rosemary, Ellen's obsession regarding that promise had always been a little matter of mirth to her. Until lately. Now it was a merciless fetter, self-imposed, but never to be shaken off. Because of it, tonight, she must turn her face from happiness. It was true that the shy, sweet rosebud love she had given to her boy lover she could never give to another. But she knew now that she could give to John Meredith a love richer and more womanly. She knew that he touched deeps in her nature that Martin had never touched, that had not perhaps been in the girl of 17 to touch. And she must send him away tonight, send him back to his lonely hearth and his empty life and his heartbreaking problems, because she had promised Ellen 10 years before, on their mother's Bible, that she would never marry. John Meredith did not immediately grasp his opportunity. On the contrary, he talked for 2 good hours on the least lover-like of subjects. He even tried politics, though politics always bored Rosemary. The latter began to think that she had been altogether mistaken, and her fears and expectations suddenly seemed to her grotesque. She felt flat and foolish. The glow went out of her face and the luster out of her eyes. John Meredith had not the slightest intention of asking her to marry him. And then, quite suddenly, he rose, came across the room, and standing by her chair, he asked it. The room had grown terribly still. Even St. George ceased to purr. Rosemary heard her own heart beating and was sure John Meredith must hear it too. Now was the time for her to say no, gently but firmly. She had been ready for days with her stilted, regretful little formula, and now the words of it had completely vanished from her mind. She had to say no, and she suddenly found she could not say it. It was the impossible word. She knew now that it was not that she could have loved John Meredith, but that she did love him. The thought of putting him from her life was agony. She must say something. She lifted her bowed golden head and asked him stammeringly to give her a few days for consideration. John Meredith was a little surprised. He was not vainer than any man has a right to be, but he had expected that Rosemary West would say yes. He had been tolerably sure she cared for him. Then why this doubt, this hesitation? She was not a schoolgirl to be uncertain as to her own mind. He felt an ugly shock of disappointment and dismay, but he assented to her request with his unfailing, gentle courtesy and went away at once. "I will tell you in a few days," said Rosemary, with downcast eyes and burning face. When the door shut behind him, she went back into the room and wrung her hands. Chapter 22. St. George Knows All About It. At midnight, Ellen West was walking home from the Pollock silver wedding. She had stayed a little while after the other guests had gone to help the gray-haired bride wash the dishes. The distance between the two houses was not far and the road good, so that Ellen was enjoying the walk back home in the moonlight. The evening had been a pleasant one. Ellen, who had not been to a party for years, found it very pleasant. All the guests had been members of her old set, and there was no intrusive youth to spoil the flavor, for the only son of the bride and groom was far away at college and could not be present. Norman Douglas had been there, and they had met socially for the first time in years, though she had seen him once or twice in church that winter. Not the least sentiment was awakened in Ellen's heart by their meeting. She was accustomed to wonder, when she thought about it at all, how she could have ever fancied him or felt so badly over his sudden marriage. But she had rather liked meeting him again. She had forgotten how bracing and stimulating he could be. No gathering was ever stagnant when Norman Douglas was present. Everybody had been surprised when Norman came. It was well known he never went anywhere. The Pollocks had invited him because he had been one of the original guests, but they never thought he would come. He had taken his second cousin, Amy Annetta Douglas, out to supper and seemed rather attentive to her. But Ellen sat across the table from him and had a spirited argument with him. An argument during which all his shouting and banter could not fluster her, and in which she came off best, flooring Norman so composedly and so completely that he was silent for 10 minutes. At the end of which time he had muttered in his ruddy beard, "Spunky as ever, spunky as ever," and began to hector Amy Annetta, who giggled foolishly over his sallies, where Ellen would have retorted bitingly. Ellen thought these things over as she walked home, tasting them with reminiscent relish. The moonlit air sparkled with frost, the snow crisped under her feet. Below her lay the glen, with the white harbour beyond. There was a light in the manse study. So John Meredith had gone home. Had he asked Rosemary to marry him? And after what fashion had she made her refusal known? Ellen felt that she would never know this, though she was quite curious. She was sure Rosemary would never tell her anything about it, and she would not dare to ask. She must just be content with the fact of the refusal. After all, that was the only thing that really mattered. "I hope you'll have enough sense to come back once in a while and be friendly," she said to herself. She disliked so much to be alone that thinking aloud was one of her devices for circumventing unwelcome solitude. "It's awful never to have a man body with some brains to talk to once in a while. And like as not he'll never come near the house again. There's Norman Douglas, too. I like that man, and I'd like to have a good rousing argument with him now and then. But he'd never dare come up for fear people would think he was courting me again. For fear I'd think it too, most likely, though he's more a stranger to me now than John Meredith. It seems like a dream that we could ever have been beaux. But there it is. There's only 2 men in the Glen I'd ever want to talk to. And what with gossip and this wretched love-making business, it's not likely I'll ever see either of them again." "I could," said Ellen, addressing the unmoved stars with a spiteful emphasis, "I could have made a better world myself." She paused at her gate with a sudden vague feeling of alarm. There was still a light in the living room, and to and fro across the window shades went the shadow of a woman walking restlessly up and down. What was Rosemary doing up at this hour of the night? And why was she striding about like a lunatic? Ellen went softly in. As she opened the hall door, Rosemary came out of the room. She was flushed and breathless. An atmosphere of stress and passion hung about her like a garment. "Why aren't you in bed, Rosemary?" demanded Ellen. "Come in here," said Rosemary intensely. "I want to tell you something." Ellen composedly removed her wraps and overshoes and followed her sister into the warm, fire-lighted room. She stood with her hand on the table and waited. She was looking very handsome herself in her own grim, black-browed style. The new black velvet dress, with its train and V-neck, which she had made purposely for the party, became her stately, massive figure. She wore coiled around her neck the rich, heavy necklace of amber beads, which was a family heirloom. Her walk in the frosty air had stung her cheeks into a glowing scarlet, but her steel blue eyes were as icy and unyielding as the sky of the winter night. She stood waiting in a silence which Rosemary could break only by a convulsive effort. "Ellen, Mr. Meredith was here this evening." "Yes." And he asked me to marry him." "So I expected. Of course you refused him." "No." "Rosemary." Ellen clenched her hands and took an involuntary step forward. "Do you mean to tell me that you accepted him?" "No, no." Ellen recovered her self-command. "What did you do then?" I asked him to give me a few days to think it over." "I hardly see why that was necessary," said Ellen, coldly contemptuous, "when there is only one answer you can make him." Rosemary held out her hands beseechingly. "Ellen," she said desperately, "I love John Meredith. I want to be his wife. Will you set me free from that promise?" "No," said Ellen, merciless, because she was sick from fear. "Ellen, Ellen—" "Listen," interrupted Ellen. "I did not ask you for that promise. You offered it." I know. But I did not think then that I could ever care for anyone again." "You offered it," went on Ellen unmovably. "You promised it over our mother's Bible. It was more than a promise. It was an oath. Now you want to break it." "I only asked you to set me free from it, Ellen." "I will not do it. A promise is a promise in my eyes. I will not do it. Break your promise, be forsworn if you will, but it shall not be with any assent of mine." "You are very hard on me, Ellen." "Hard on you? And what of me? Have you ever given a thought to what my loneliness would be if you left me? I could not bear it. I would go crazy. I cannot live alone. Haven't I been a good sister to you? Have I ever opposed any wish of yours? Haven't I indulged you in everything?" "Yes, yes." "Then why do you want to leave me for this man whom you hadn't seen a year ago?" "I love him, Ellen." "Love? You talk like a schoolmiss instead of a middle-aged woman. He doesn't love you. He wants a housekeeper and a governess. You don't love him. You want to be Mrs. You are one of those weak-minded women who think it's a disgrace to be ranked as an old maid. That's all there is to it." Rosemary quivered. Ellen could not, or would not, understand. There was no use arguing with her. "So you won't release me, Ellen?" "No, I won't. And I won't talk of it again. You promised, and you've got to keep your word. That's all. Go to bed. Look at the time. You're all romantic and worked up. Tomorrow you'll be more sensible. At any rate, don't let me hear any more of this nonsense. Go." Rosemary went without another word, pale and spiritless. Ellen walked stormily about the room for a few minutes, then paused before the chair where St. George had been calmly sleeping through the whole evening. A reluctant smile overspread her dark face. There had only been one time in her life, the time of her mother's death, when Ellen had not been able to temper tragedy with comedy. Even in that long-ago bitterness, when Norman Douglas had, after a fashion, jilted her, she had laughed at herself quite as often as she had cried. "I expect there'll be some sulking, St. George. Yes, Saint, I expect we are in for a few unpleasant, foggy days. Well, we'll weather them through, George. We've dealt with foolish children before, Saint. Rosemary'll sulk a while, and then she'll get over it, and all will be as before, George. She promised, and she's got to keep her promise. And that's the last word on the subject I'll say to you or her or anyone, Saint." But Ellen lay savagely awake till morning. There was no sulking, however. Rosemary was pale and quiet the next day, but beyond that Ellen could detect no difference in her. Certainly she seemed to bear Ellen no grudge. It was stormy, so no mention was made of going to church. In the afternoon Rosemary shut herself in her room and wrote a note to John Meredith. She could not trust herself to say no in person. She felt quite sure that if he suspected she was saying no reluctantly, he would not take it for an answer, and she could not face pleading or entreaty. She must make him think she cared nothing at all for him, and she could do that only by letter. She wrote him the stiffest, coolest little refusal imaginable. It was barely courteous. It certainly left no loophole of hope for the boldest lover, and John Meredith was anything but that. He shrank into himself, hurt and mortified, when he read Rosemary's letter next day in his dusty study. But under his mortification a dreadful realization presently made itself felt. He had thought he did not love Rosemary as deeply as he had loved Cecilia. Now, when he had lost her, he knew that he did. She was everything to him, everything, and he must put her out of his life completely. Even friendship was impossible now. Life stretched before him in intolerable dreariness. He must go on. There was his work, his children, but the heart had gone out of him. He sat all alone that evening in his dark, cold, comfortless study, with his head bowed in his hands. Up on the hill, Rosemary had a headache and went early to bed, while Ellen remarked to St. George, purring his disdain of foolish humankind who did not know that a soft cushion was the only thing that really mattered, "What would women do if headaches had never been invented, St. George? But never mind, Saint. We'll just wink the other eye for a few weeks. I admit I don't feel comfortable myself, George. I feel as if I had drowned a kitten. But she promised, Saint, and she was the one to offer it, George. Bismillah.